Well, hello, Mike. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm here in very humid New York City.
Oh, my goodness. Wow. Well, I know you, and I think a lot of other people know you, but how about you take just, a short time because we've got a lot of things we want to cover, but just introduce yourself to some folks.
Sure, yeah. So I've been on both sides of the table, three consulting firms, six public companies, kind of lived and worked around the world as a global gypsy. And I'm currently teaching at NYU, Erasmus, and then also helping World at Work. That's quick on
Awesome.
me.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, yeah, that is quick. It's hard to take, a really long storied career and make you put it into 10 seconds. But speaking of long and storied, what a great day today was. A lot of great insights and good content, and kudos to our host for doing this. But one of the things that I didn't hear, we heard about tangentially, but I don't think we can close out without getting a little provocative, particularly with you. And that is, let's tease out a little bit about the geopolitical environment and quite frankly, the very real impact that has on mobility. I'd welcome your thoughts. We just closed out, the G7 summit. And, what's your overarching sort of takeaways and the impact to mobility?
Oh, many. Well, first of all, it was a great session, obviously, in the UK a couple of weeks ago. There were two things that caught my eye. First, I think, obviously, we've had a major change in the political landscape in the US. So there was a very strong statement from the G7, and I quote, open, resilient, rules-based world order. And if you then translate that into the mobility sphere, that means global institutions, employment, tax, permanent establishment, employment law is going to be back on the front and center. So human rights, the rule of law, gender equality, even tensions between states and conflict. I think that was caught my eye. The second one was pretty cool about, it's been bantied about a lot, as you know, Peggy, this so-called notion of a singular corporate tax to level the playing field. So there was a discussion to make it fair across the world that the G7 pledged we will, quote, reach consensus on a global agreement on an equitable solution, taxing rights at a 15% on a country-by-country basis. And that has been thought about, I think, if I'm not mistaken, for 20 years. So, for example, the mobility world, as you know, Peggy, like you were at Microsoft, I was at tons of companies. I had set up global employment companies in Ireland because the corporate tax rate, I think, was 10 or 13%. You can't do that anymore. So you have to rethink even things like those devices.
Yeah, that is a great point. Our GES was based out of Switzerland, so a country that you used to live
Okay.
in. But
Yeah.
you teased on a couple of quick things there, and I want to pick up the part with respect to mobility. So, given this backdrop and some of these things, what do you think? Where and what should mobility be doing right now today?
Spot on. So you and I have been doing this for a long time. So I think first is a mindset shift. So just to be very candid and provocative, which I usually am, is that it's not mobility. It's basically workforce deployment. It's all shapes and sizes, and it's the new norm. So it's not traditional expatriate moves. It's jobs to people and people to jobs. That's the new norm, right? And how do we re-equip our professionals that cannot only focus on point A to point B to point C, is really being joined to the hip with talent deployment, talent acquisition, reward to deploy on demand. And it's like the theme today, remote workers. That's a completely different playing field than point A to point B. So it truly and fulfillingly is a workforce deployment shift in mindset. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I've heard you talk about it in those languages, and some of those things we've talked about for a long period of time. We just haven't brought it all together collectively, given what the post pandemic world and the amplification of worker preferences. So I, really want to pull apart a little bit more around sort of what are the participation, labor participation challenges beyond, say, highly skilled workers. We all know the highly skilled challenge because we've been talking about that, but what do you think about that? Plus, beyond that?
Yeah, so this is a true conundrum in the labor market, as we all know. So just to put it on the table, and Josh Bersin is somebody I admire tremendously, and I quote him truly here, the problem is not that we don't have enough jobs, is that we don't have enough people. So,
Yeah.
as we all know, fertility rates have dropped in China and the US, most G7 countries. So, and people have checked out post-pandemic. So the physical participation in the labor market has actually shrunken measurably. And you have a lot of open recs, unfilled roles, particularly roles as cryptocurrency, obviously, ransomware and AI machine learning. We all know those things. But we've got to, one of the things mobility can do is help to serve and be a solution to solving this labor participation problem. So first thing is, I think the theme was today, work from anywhere and remote. It, in some form or fashion, as it emerges, it will be here for probably quite a while. And that by doing so, if you can increase, if you will, the fluidity of labor movement remotely, virtually, or even in short term wise, it actually fulfills this labor market problem. We just don't have enough people for the jobs that are open. And it's 6 months, it's completely flipped on a dime.
Yeah, you know what? I think it's also, I mean, we, as you noted, the population replacement rates have been declining for a long period of time, right? I think what, and largely all continents with the exception of Africa and in countries within
Right.
Africa, right? So I think there's going to be a real interesting sort of dynamic that occurs there, and whether or not the Silk Road initiatives continue on and the investments there. And to your point, how do you get access to that talent, even if it's a WFA environment? That makes it even stronger and even better. So that's, I think that's kind of been there for a while. But what's interesting to me in the post-pandemic world, aside from STEM and the highly skilled, is particularly now in the US, we're seeing, now that all these mandates have been lifted and cities and states are opening up, they actually, restaurants and some of the entertainment in those areas where you work remote is not a possibility. But what has come out of that is, to your point, labor participation, because people that are coming from post pandemic are saying, I don't want to go back to that world. And so, that's another conundrum, is the not the highly skilled, because that's obviously always been there, but the other elements where you have to be there. So I'm curious what thoughts, if any, that you would have around how do you rationalize that when it may not necessarily be right for hybrid.
Oh, it's bingo. So frontline essential workers, apart from hospitality, I'm in New York City, my home, and it's fully reopened, right? So I go to a restaurant and they admit openly they can't staff fully to open, literally. So one of the things I think, humbly speaking, the way we can solve some of this is being a little more porous about immigration fluidity. So yes, we know we have a border issue, for example, in the US, and the vice president's working on that for the president. But we've got to allow more labor participation for frontline hospitality roles, for civilian roles, for essential workers. And this is where mobility can play a labor participation role to actually permit our economies to become more buoyant if you have more people to do the work. That's a role we can play, a very, very simple role, but and I think, we have, if you will, at will employment in the States with a not as strong safety net as we have in Europe. So,
Right.
obviously the administration's introduced a lot of sustainability measures, but the ability to sustainably and gainfully seek and reap employment. It's a very different landscape in Asia, obviously, and in Europe where I live. But so it's difficult. You can't call it out global. Each sort of piece of the pie is very different in each region of the world.
Yeah. It's interesting. And one of the earlier teases this morning we talked about was, and even now in our conversation, quite frankly, Mike, everything we're referring to assumes a full time employment model. And, it assumes, regardless of where they work, we're talking about them being, dedicated or nearly dedicated to a single employer. What I want to ask a little bit is maybe to shift that lens and talk about like a permanent fractional work model, where people they want to work, I want to work for me, and working
Yes.
for me
Yes.
means a lot of different things, right? And I think we're going to continue to see that me generation, that me economy comes out, right? And so I'm curious, your perspective from a compliance lens with that. So, what needs to be considered there, and again, the role for mobility.
So, yes, indeed. So, not only WFA, but fractional work is first and foremost the forefront now, the labor participation. And part of the reason why people have checked out is because, to your point, it was singular employment employee. That's it. It was bimodal. I'm not into that, so I checked out. So the new norm, like you said, is you got to get, if you will, regulations that permit more fluidity around, for example, tax hopping. So you hop around as a hybrid worker, and there's domestic hybrid, and then there's what I call, you and I know, international hybrid. That's a very different beast.
Right.
So one of the things, fractional work for hybrids, we've got to tackle that the tax normative system is tied to jurisdiction and residence. It has to be more
Mm-hmm.
fluid. And so we need a very tangible way to bring more fluidity to tax consequences. Another one is immigration, which obviously Frogman and everybody are awesome at this, but it's, is it in or out, or is it actually move, move, move? So is it
Yeah.
causality driven? Is it purpose driven? And a lot of immigration norms tend to be related to residence, role, and skill. It might be better because we need more fluidity to have a little bit of a different lens on that. And then employment law, as we know, you got employment at will in the US, you have contractual law in the UK and pan EU. It's got to be more fluid. So these three things, if you got governments and the private sector working together to solve these critical regulatory hurdles, to harmonize them and make them more fluid, that might tend to permit more fluidity in the labor market. And we can play a role in
And
that.
yeah, one of the things that occurs as you're sharing your thoughts there, Mike, is the redesigning of mobility. And we've watched this through our career sort of redesign itself a few times. I feel that we're at another pivot point given the employment models, the labor participation that you talked about. And that pivot point is, mobility moving from less on talent acquisition, which I don't like. I actually prefer that. But I worry that it's maybe going to slip deeper into compliance structures largely because of all this talent fluidity that's going to occur, that they're going to be called upon along with external partners to be the compliance function for labor more so than they exist today. And it will become more of not, I think, less strategic, but more sort of punitive, and making sure we don't
Yeah.
run afoul of any, sort of findings, signs, which I think would be in my opinion, a real travesty. I'd love to see us continue to stay on the forefront around using talent to solve business objectives rather than looking at it like, oh, well, you can't do that. You can't do that. You're a foul here. You're not right there. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Yeah. So we can't be building, to your aforementioned point, compliance mobility police, right? So we got to be problem solvers for workforce deployment, right? And so, therefore, the business problem to solve is either you buy the talent or you build the talent, to your point. Gig economy, I want to work for myself, so we'll get all that. WFA here to stay, hybrid here to stay, I get all that. So basically, if you say you can't send a hybrid to, let's say, Madras or Mumbai because of XYZ, labor, immigration, tax, business ain't going to listen to you. So come back to
Right.
me when you solve the problem, right? And tell me a way that I can deploy XYZ persona to Mumbai hybridly. Make that happen. And typically that's the business asks. And it's our job to not simply move point A from point B, but actually architect the ecosystem to permit hybridism to work. That's a very, very different skill set than traditional mobility. And we're being asked to do that now.
Yeah, yeah. I
Right?
think I think it's an exciting time for us, but as
Yeah.
always in the past, I think we also have the ability to shape our path a little bit. Let me, hard to believe, Mike, we're already out of time, but
Yeah.
I can't leave this without one final question on predictions. As you know me
Sure.
and taking advantage of you. If you had your crystal ball here, when do you project that we will hit labor stabilization?
We won't. It's just to be very
You
blunt.
just
I know
took
you.
the ball and tossed it.
No, it's just look. I've lived in 9 countries. I can speak to it personally. I lived like Japan is huge conundrum. Shortfall, right? Replacement ratio way down, right? China's the same. You can now have 5 or 10 kids, but they don't want to have 10 kids in China, and so forth. And same in my beautiful country in the USA. So the replacement ratio problem ain't going away. And
Right.
so maybe the way to frame it is not stabilization, but participation with the right skill moving and us allowing that workforce deployment to become more fluid. But I
Yeah.
sadly to say, I could be wrong. I probably am wrong, but I think participation won't be at the rates it was pre-pandemic. It just won't be.
Yeah. I think it is, and what do they always say? When you end something, you leave them wanting more, right? So we're going to leave them wanting more, so we get invited back. But Mike, it's been a pleasure to see you,
Thank you.
and I appreciate
As
the
well.
time and graciousness to our host for having me here, and well, and
Thank you very much. Thank you.